Okay, welcome everyone. It is 6:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host for tonight, Heather Cook. I'm a sophomore at the College of Worcester studying political science and history. I work at the Behringer-Crawford Museum as a visitor service associate when I'm not in school. And tonight I'm very excited to welcome you, welcome our presenter from the Behringer-Crawford Museum. But first, let's thank all of our sponsors. History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's History Museum. Behringer-Crawford Museum is supported in part by the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph B. Hale Jr. U.S. Bank Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining us for access to discounts, exclusive programming, and other benefits, as well as the great community that you will join here at the museum. You can learn more and join at our website, bcmuseum.org. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few reminders. Everyone's microphone has been muted upon entering the meeting tonight, just so that we can all focus on the presentation. You can turn your camera on or off depending on what you prefer, but others on the call will be able to see you while your camera is on, even while the screen is being shared. If you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat feature, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible immediately following the presentation. There will also be a trivia question tonight. The first person to answer correctly in the chat will win a Northern Kentucky History Hour pin. So let's meet tonight's speaker. Cathy Collopy has worked at the Dinsmore Homestead Museum for the past 20 years. Previously, she taught 8th grade United States history in Kenton County. In addition to her museum work, she has taught a variety of history courses at the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash, Xavier University, and Northern Kentucky University. Cathy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Is this where you want the trivia question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the trivia question for tonight doesn't exactly have to do with what I'm talking about, but it does have to do with the Dinsmore Homestead. So the last member of the Dinsmore family to stay here for any period of time in the 1970s and 80s was Martha Breasted, and she was the daughter-in-law of someone famous in his own time. Who was that person and what was he famous for? And do I start the presentation now?
Yeah, go ahead and start,
Okay.
and then people can answer throughout the presentation.
Okay, super. Let's see. So tonight I'm talking about workers on the Dinsmore farm because we don't talk about them very much. So we have a nice main house with all original artifacts, and that seems to get a lot of our tour time. But it was actually the people who worked on the farm for 120 years, from 1842 to the 1960s, who actually made the Dinsmore family as wealthy as they were. Although generations did leave the farm and make money in other ways, they're the ones that really made this farm a success when it was a success. So let's see, James Dinsmore brought his wife, Martha, and 3 daughters and 11 enslaved people to Boone County in 1842. He died 30 years later, leaving the farm to his daughter, Julia, who was the only one left. She died in 1926, passing the farm off to several non-resident relatives over the years. And it was the last member, that Martha Breasted, who decided to turn the farm over to a private foundation, the Dinsmore Homestead Foundation. And today they're responsible for running what is a main house with all original artifacts, over 11 outbuildings original to the farm, including the graveyard. And we're very lucky to have 90,000 pages of primary sources for the family from the 1700s to the 1900s. So farm workers get very little of our attention in history, primarily because they don't leave much behind. So we can find them in census records, we can find them in tax records, but there isn't a whole lot written about what their lives were like. And I'm not going to be able to fill in a whole lot of that, but I hope to do some sort of job in making their lives a little bit more human. Let's see. So I picked 4 men who span the time periods. They generally overlap with each other, but they each represent a different part of Dinsmore history. So James Dinsmore actually was born in New Hampshire, graduated from Dartmouth in 1813. And in that year or the next year, he was sent to Kentucky to go pick up his sick brother. On the trip, he kept a really terse journal. But when he crossed from Ohio into Kentucky, he wrote, "Crossed the Ohio at Limestone, and alas, see for the first time in my life a slave. O fortunate New England, all thy sons are free." Within 12 years, he was purchasing African Americans because when he thought about what he wanted to do with his life, it did not include working with his hands. He went down south, which was rather unusual for someone from New Hampshire. Usually they move to Ohio or Indiana, just directly west. He decided he could make more money going down to Natchez, Mississippi. He started practicing law down there and got in good with a very wealthy family, the Minor family. And this is their house that used to exist just outside of Natchez. He tutored their sons, and he eventually went in as partners on a plantation in Louisiana. But it was the Miners who, I believe, probably encouraged him to start purchasing African Americans. He bought 7 in 1825 and put them on one of the Minor plantations, and then was given a percentage of the profits from that plantation. And just as a side note, since this is Northern Kentucky history, Stephen Minor was the man who bought this house. His grandson, Kenner, was the one who built Somerset Hall in Ludlow, Kentucky, on Kenner Avenue or Kenner Street. I'm not sure which one. So there's another connection. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Koa, and he was owned by the Minor family. He was actually born in West Africa, though. The only way we know that is a really random letter written by James Dinsmore's granddaughter, Sally, to her sister, Patty. She was out over in Europe visiting with her aunt, Julia Dinsmore, and she wrote to Patty from Paris, quote, "There are 2 curiosities in this hotel. One, the Buttons at the door, who is a good-looking, very black boy in a bright red fez, with the marks of his tribe cut into his cheeks, as Mommy says Uncle Koa had." So that tells us that Koa came from West Africa, where there was a practice to make tribal marks either when the child was very young or when they reached adulthood. For Koa, it's probably when he was young. We estimate he was born around 1789, just 1 year before James. And although there were some illegal shipments of Africans after 1808, they were not very numerous. So he probably came to the US before the Constitution ended the slave trade. But he was kidnapped, shipped to Louisiana, and at some point purchased by the Minor family, who owned several plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi. Dinsmore and Minor became partners in a plantation in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, that James called Bayou Black Plantation. And that's where Koa was sent to work there raising sugarcane and cotton. Dinsmore had about 80 enslaved people working on the plantation. Among them was a female named Winnie. Winnie was actually originally owned by Silas Dinsmore. He was forced to sell her by a court order because he owed debts, along with about 9 other enslaved people. So James bought them and sent most of them to Mobile, Alabama to build a fort. Winnie, he took to Louisiana to take care of his wife and daughters. Although marriages were illegal, slave owners did like to see their enslaved people get married so that they would have less chance of running away. So there was probably some sort of ceremony for Koa and Winnie when they were married. Sugar plantations were run slightly differently than cotton plantations. When you harvest the sugar cane, it has to be grounded and boiled quickly. So it required a lot of work in a short period of time. And for that reason, a lot of sugar plantation owners, not all of them, but a lot of them did pay enslaved people for taking what they called turns in the sugar house and for working on Sundays. So you can see this is a document left by James, and it shows all the people he's paying for working on Sundays. Lindor up here worked 5 Sunday nights, sugar making, and made $7.50. So he's not paying them very much. Koa made $10.12. So he worked 7 or 8 Sundays and nights. Sunday was their only day off. So that means they're working 7 days a week. He also kept personal accounts for each of the enslaved people. So he paid them for produce that they might raise. They had to sell it to him, and he would sell it from there. When they wanted to purchase something, then he would use that money to purchase it. Only he did the purchasing. So for Koa, this kind of helps us at least say something about him. Some of the things he bought: tobacco, whiskey, flour, socks, striped material for pantaloons, check material for a dress for Winnie, shoes, and cash. Things that he did to earn the money: he hauled a steam engine through the swamp. He boated shells, which were used to make chimneys. He helped build a sugar house, and he paid various other enslaved people for James. He sold oranges, chickens, moss, honey, and wood to Dinsmore. So this sort of arrangement was beneficial to both the enslaved people and the owner, because it allowed Koa to purchase things that maybe not other slaves were purchasing. He could wear clothes that distinguished him. But for James, it meant that he didn't have to pay out as much money for clothes for the slaves, and he didn't have to give them as much in food if they were raising some themselves. Did it make Koa feel like he wasn't enslaved? I really doubt it. The Dinsmores occasionally included the enslaved people in their correspondence. So I do consider James what historians would call a paternalistic slave owner, where he justified owning people because he convinced himself he was doing something good for them. And in this letter from 1939, he had just returned to Louisiana from Kentucky. Quote, "Poor creatures, their conduct has been excellent since we left here, and they seem comfortable and happy. My mind is more resolved than ever to do them justice, and more than justice if God spares my life." Of course, he never did them justice according to what we would consider it, but he did seem to feel that slavery in Kentucky was not really slavery. The fact that one of the enslaved men, Isaac Sanders, ran away from the farm in Kentucky indicates that the enslaved people knew what slavery was. Martha Dinsmore wrote about the ill health of African Americans in Kentucky and told James to warn them about it. But, quote, "Should they persist in preferring to come with you to Kentucky, why, you must indulge them and let them come, but not without telling them it is at their own risk." So for some reason, she thought that Louisiana was healthier than Kentucky. When James and Martha were separated, they included some of the enslaved people in their closing remarks of their letters. In 1938, James purchased a farm in Kentucky in Boone County, about a mile from the river. He didn't move there until 1842 because he could not sell his plantation. In 1841 and early 1842, his brother was on the property overseeing the building of the main house and the kitchen, which was done by John Brady. The society Dinsmore brought his wife and 3 daughters and 11 enslaved people to was quite different from the society they left in Louisiana. So in Louisiana, the average slaveholder had 24 slaves. In Kentucky, it was 5.5. In Boone County, it was even lower at 4. In Kentucky, or in Boone County, almost 25% of the 1840 population was enslaved, and that number was dropping. In Louisiana, it was almost 48%. And if you count free Blacks, it was over 50%. While large plantations in Louisiana, considering James had 60 to 80 enslaved people on his plantation, it wouldn't have been very difficult for someone to find a spouse on the plantation. In Kentucky, that was much more difficult. So while Koa lived on the farm that James Dinsmore owned, his wife, Winnie, lived a mile away on Silas Dinsmore's farm. That means they saw each other from Saturday evening to Sunday evening, and that's it, 1 day a week. This would have been somewhat typical for couples in the county. living arrangements were different also. So this is a picture of the cabin that we believe Koa and the other adult male, Jim, would have stayed in. This is a picture of Nancy Magruder years later at that cabin. So they were quite close to James Dinsmore's house, not as close as Sally Taylor, who would have been taking care of the cooking and the children and the cleaning of the house. She was really close, but they were much closer than the tenants. The tenants were splayed out all over the farm. So in Louisiana, the enslaved people tended to live like in a village almost, far away from the main house, unless they worked in the house. But most of the enslaved people would have been field slaves, and they would have had some sort of privacy from the main family, not in Kentucky. Work arrangements were also different. Because the crops that James grew, which were fruit trees, wheat, rye, corn, willows, grapes, and the hogs and sheep as stock animals, there was little in the way of an opportunity to work on Sundays. So keeping those individual accounts for the enslaved people didn't work in Kentucky the way it did in Louisiana. Instead, the adult slaves, Koa, Jim, Sally, and Nancy, would instead receive random bits of money. So here we see $3 for Koa. James sends him to the local store for $5.21. But he does not have much of a chance to raise more money than that. Koa does receive, though, and this is kind of interesting, he receives money for raising willows, which becomes a big business on the Boone County farm. He also sells grapes to some of the tenants working for James. So he seems to know what's making money, and he does make some money doing that, but not as much as he would have in Louisiana. Daily work-wise, Koa's life was quite different also. When the family moved to Kentucky, he was over 50 years old, which I think would translate to 60 or 70 today. So James's wife, Martha, did keep notes on what some of the people, the workers, were doing while James was away in New York or Louisiana. And you can find that Koa is either in the garden, getting wood, or doing other chores, regular chores, maybe taking care of the animals. So he was kept close to the main house. The younger men, Daniel and John, were doing the hard work along with the men that Martha referred to as the Dutchmen. Interestingly, James did hire his tenants or hire his enslaved people out to the tenants and the neighbors. So here you see Daniel worked 3 days for William Majors gathering corn. Koa, John, and Daniel worked for William Majors 7 days this week per his account. So Mr. Majors would have to pay that money back later, or have to pay the labor back is what he usually did. Historians describe this as a way to allow people who don't own slaves to experience mastery. And during the Civil War, men like William Majors might be likely then to support the Confederacy. It didn't always work out that way. In 1862, Koa died. Koa died at about 73 years old. James went to Lawrenceburg. It cost him $3 to go to Lawrenceburg to buy Koa a shroud at $2.50. Most of the people in the graveyard have a coffin unless they were cremated. So the fact that Koa chose to be buried in a shroud indicates he was wanting to do it the way his forefathers had done it in West Africa. We do have a mort cloth that we believe may have been woven by some of the enslaved people, and it's usually used to cover a coffin. It may have been used to cover Koa before he was buried up on the hill. He is within the walls of the graveyard. He has a flat rock marking his grave. James wrote an epitaph for Koa, which kind of also repeats this paternalistic refrain. Quote, "In memory of Koa, a native of Africa, a good and faithful servant who has entered into the joy of the Lord." The epitaph was never made use of, perhaps a sign of how easily it was for James to forget Koa. The next person I want to talk about is John Deck, who started out as Johannes Deck. James called him Hannes Deck every now and then. He was born in Bavaria in 1825 and came to the US on the Yorktown, landing in New York City when he was about 23 years old. He moved to Cincinnati, where I am assuming he met up with his brother Peter and some other people from his home country. He shows up on the Dinsmore farm in the mid-1850s, so not that long after he got to Cincinnati. The German story at Dinsmore began in the 1840s when James decided to raise osier willows. I'm not sure where he got the idea, but I'm assuming he ran into a basket shop while on one of his many trips to Cincinnati, or perhaps on a steamboat trip, he got talking to people. Men like to trade stories of successes and failures on the steamboat, and maybe he heard about willows then. It turned out to be a really good tip wherever he got it. But the swampy land on Dinsmore near the Middle Creek was a great place for raising osier willows, apparently. And there were plenty of German immigrants in Cincinnati willing to come out and help him with the willows. So he raised willows for several years before the Germans actually came out. He would send them to Cincinnati in very large bundles. His brother or his cousin Thomas was actually the first one to actually have baskets made on his property and send them to Cincinnati. James was mostly interested for 15 years in raising the willows and sending them to Cincinnati where they were made into baskets. Franz Schneider was the first German immigrant to arrive on the farm in 1850, but he was followed by dozens of men, some of whom became tenants, some of whom just stayed for the season and then went back to Cincinnati. Some of them lived on other farms and came here as day laborers, and some of them stayed permanently in other areas of Boone County. When Dinsmore moved to Boone County, he had been keeping really close tabs on his tenants, when they missed work and why they missed work. So here you see Mr. Simmons lost by his cut leg 1 week less 2 days. Mr. Simmons lost 1 whole week visiting his friends and by cold. By the time the German immigrants start coming out in the 1850s, he had pretty much given this up. I think he probably just felt like he had too many tenants to deal with it. So unfortunately, we don't get the kind of detail with the German immigrants that we get with Mr. Simmons and some of the early tenants. Instead of keeping accounts for these tenants, he decided to settle with them twice a year in June and December, writing down in one column everything they did for him, in another column everything he did for them. Sometimes some of the tenants would end up losing money that way and would have to continue working for James. But John Deck and the other German tenants actually did quite well. John Deck is just one example of the many German immigrants. In Hamilton County, the foreign-born population was 40% in 1860. In Boone County, it was just 7%, compared to Kenton at 29 and Campbell at 30. So Deck must have felt rather isolated when he stepped off the farm. Apparently, though, he saw a business opportunity that could not be passed up. And the fact that the Dinsmore farm was so close to Cincinnati, so close to the river, allowed him to go to Cincinnati when he wanted to, which is where he met his wife, Eva Schmidt. Unfortunately, the records relating to the German immigrants, though not minuscule, don't tell us a whole lot about their lives. Like other tenants, they worked for James for $12 a month in the summer and $10 a month in the winter. Dinsmore had a willow shop built on the property for the storing and steaming of the willows. Deck and others were expected to do that work, though the peeling of the willows was done by local women and children. The final product, shipped in bundles to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, was split between James, who got one half, and the Germans, who split the other half. This is kind of an example of a typical agreement that would have been made, where the tenants agreed to cultivate said willows thoroughly by plowing and hoeing at proper seasons so as to keep them clear of weeds, and also to cut and peel the same in the best manner and dry them for the market. On James's part, and this was written for Thomas Dinsmore, his cousin, they gave him a house, they gave him a pasture for 1 cow and 1 horse, and 4 acres of land to cultivate in vegetables. So that is a somewhat typical agreement. And since James wrote it out for Thomas Dinsmore, it's probably a lot like what he wrote out for the other Dinsmores or for the other tenants. This is an example of the baskets. By the 1860s, James's basket shop was up and running, and the tenants were making what they call the market baskets, the low one, and the closed baskets, the tall one. They made hundreds of these and made quite a bit of money from them, anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000 in a good year. This dearth of personal records does tell us that tenants did not have a close relationship with Dinsmore and his family. Some of the enslaved people are mentioned in family letters. None of the tenants are, unless they do something horrible or funny enough to mention, and that's not usually in a good way. John Deck is never mentioned. The enslaved people were forced into a close relationship with the Dinsmore family by dint of where they lived, whereas John Deck would have lived further away from the family. In the 1860s, Deck moved to the very small hamlet of Bellevue Bottoms. I feel like I read somewhere that he, his brother, and John Zimmerman helped to restart Bellevue Bottoms as a town, but I couldn't find proof of that before this presentation was due. So we know that he lived in Bellevue Bottoms. That is not his house. It's just a house in Bellevue Bottoms. And he was then renting a basket shop on someone else's property. Peter Deck was already married with a few children, and John Deck married in the 60s and probably moved so he could have a nice home for himself and his family. Before James Dinsmore died, this is the Civil War, and you can see that the Decks are doing quite good. On December 30th, James Dinsmore borrows $400 from John Deck. And this is in September 1862. Oh, nope, that is not. This one just talks about what the Decks were doing for James and what James was doing for the Decks. But it does mention, took up my two notes to John and Peter Deck and gave them a note for $648 with interest. Some of the things that John Deck was getting from James include cider, a barrel of cider, a bushel of apples, and some of the things he was doing for James, bundling willows, and he actually bought pants for David and Isaac, two enslaved men. So he probably had a decent relationship with the Black men on the property. James Dinsmore died in 1872. His middle daughter, Julia Stockton Dinsmore, took over the farm. And there is some idea that she didn't quite care much for Germans. And it's hard to tell exactly where this comes from. I have a theory that because the German immigrants tended to support the Union during the Civil War, and she tended to support the Confederacy during the Civil War, that they may have been at odds there. Also, it could be that the German immigrants did not like taking orders from a woman. Either way, she shut down the basket shop as soon as she was able to sell what remained of the baskets. The basket shop was then used as a school for a little while, and then it became a tenant house. Meanwhile, John Deck continued his basket shop, being a basket maker in Bellevue Bottoms, and his son was a basket maker after him. So you can see here, he had $1,000 worth of personal property and lived in a house worth $1,200. So he was doing quite well for himself. The Deck family stayed for several generations, and now there is a Deck Avenue somewhere near the Creation Museum. In 1903, Julia wrote that she went to Bellevue with Hilda twice to the funeral services of old Mr. Deck the last time, 36 degrees at sunup. Old Mr. Deck was only 8 years older than Julia, but his grave is nowhere to be found, or I would have taken a picture of it. There are lots of Decks in the cemetery. I believe he probably may have had a wooden cross, or maybe he didn't have a marker at all. His brother Peter doesn't show up either. But some of the German names that stayed around in Bellevue Bottoms and Petersburg for the next few generations include Schwartz, Mauer, Zimmerman, Trapp, Schmidt, which became Smith, and Hartman. The others either moved back to Cincinnati or moved further west. Dick Louden is much more representative of your typical local-born tenant. He was born in 1851 in Indiana, and I say he was somewhat typical. First of all, his father, James, married his mother, Amanda, who was a neighbor, when he was 16 and she was 14 or 15. We wouldn't consider that today, but even then it was probably seen as a little young. They may have gone to Indiana because Mr. Moreland wasn't real happy with it. However, it was not unusual for tenant families who had usually had a large number of children to send the kids off, try to get them married off before they were 18. Compare that to James and Martha. James was 38 when he married. Martha was 32. Their eldest daughter, Isabella, was 30. So I think there was a concerted effort to wait to get married so you would have fewer children. And if you were wealthy, you could afford to do that. Both Louden parents were from Kentucky, but they went to Indiana to get married. It could have been Mr. Moreland's anger, or it could have been they were looking for a better job as a tenant farmer. The first 4 or 5 children in the Louden family were born in Indiana. The next 4 were born in Kentucky. This is also somewhat typical of tenant families. So you see down at the bottom, Daniel Coons also had 1 child born in Indiana, 2 in Kentucky. Then he goes back to Indiana to have another child, and there may be even more on the next page. So it does seem like for a tenant farmer, it didn't matter what state you were in, Ohio, Indiana, or Kentucky, as far as what your condition was. So they were very much willing to move. James Dinsmore wrote to a friend that Kentucky was not a good place for enslaved labor because white labor was so cheap. In Boone County in 1850, that was definitely true. Over 50% of adult white males didn't own their own land. Some of them owned town lots. Some of them were waiting for dad to die to inherit. Most of them, though, were going to end up working on somebody else's farm the rest of their lives. There was some hope that they might be able to find a house somewhere after 20 years of labor, but most of them probably were tenants for life. Large farms in the county had a mix of enslaved and free labor. Tenant agreements that James Dinsmore made had a bit of sharecropping inserted. The worker would get a garden plot, house, field to raise what Dinsmore told him to raise, which was usually corn or wheat. And when they weren't working for themselves, they had to work for James for the same amount as the German immigrants. James Louden, the father, occasionally worked as a day laborer for Dinsmore, but he does not ever seem to have been a tenant, and he didn't live on the farm. He served in the Union Army, and when he came back, he rented a house on another farm nearby. He died in 1870, leaving his widow with 4 young children. Dick, by that time, was 19, and the census says that he had attended school that year, which seems kind of odd for a 19-year-old. I've not found his signature anywhere in our documents, but it does seem like he would have been able to read and write, unlike some of those earlier tenants on the farm. Dick Louden first shows up working sporadically on the farm in 1874. He married George Ann Eggleston a year later, and in 1878, he came to Julia asking for a job. Julia didn't trust that he would actually show up to work. He did show up, but he quit before the year was out, which made her pretty angry. In 1880, Dick returns again, wanting to work for Julia. This is what she wrote in her journal. Dick Louden came over and engaged to work for me a year from the 1st of March on the following terms. I am to give him $20 a month wet and dry during 6 months, beginning April 1st. The rest of the year, he is to work for me at the rate of 75 cents a day and to lose the time during weather too bad to work in. I am to furnish him a home and garden rent-free and wood and a team to haul it and to break his garden, horse to go to mill, etc. It is scarcely worthwhile to set down this bargain because he is so unreliable, but he says he will come. He did come, and he spent the next 31 years on the farm working for Julia Dinsmore. Named his youngest daughter, Julia Dinsmore. And Julia does write occasionally that she lets her namesake come in the house and stay overnight with her. So her opinion of Dick changed radically over time. His house was somewhere near the old willow shop near Middle Creek. There are a few spots still where daffodils come up in the spring, and I imagine that those may have been planted by the Loudons. By this time, burley tobacco was the main crop being produced on Boone County farms and particularly in Bellevue Bottoms. Julia kept tabs on the tenants through a 54-year journal she kept. It was a business book and not for personal reflections, though occasionally those did creep in. Whereas James might have had as many as 10 men working as tenants, Julia had 2 or 3, except on threshing days and slaughtering the hogs. At least one of these men was usually a Black man related to the Taylor or Hawkins families that had moved to Indiana after the Civil War. Like the German tenants, it is difficult to imagine what life was like for these men and their families, because Julia only writes what work they did and how much they received for their tobacco. This is not a picture of the Loudon house. I don't know what it would have looked like. I imagine it may have looked like this, but we don't really know. Another member of the Dinsmore family, Julia's younger cousin, Charlie Flandreau, made the little community around the farm sound scandalous. But Flandreau often wrote deprecatingly about Kentucky, so I don't know how seriously to take him. He wrote in 1938, quote, "The other night I went to see Desire Under the Elms and found it interesting, although I don't see why it should have made so much talk. There is nothing especially novel in a young man falling in love with his stepmother. And to one who has known all his life of the sexual aberrations of the poor whites on cousin Julia's farm in Boone County, anything that James O'Neill has up his sleeve in the way of a plot must necessarily seem exceedingly tame." To support this idea of things going on the farm, Julia noted in her journal, or she had this stuck in her journal. It was a little note written in pencil. "Notice Miss J. Dinsmore. If you don't get them away from here, there will be mobbed, and we will give you 10 days to get them away. If you don't, your place will be turned upside down. Your barn will burn. There are making trouble between man and wife." So apparently there was some dalliances among the Blacks and the whites on the farm. There was no date on the note. Julia said it was on her gate. I'm assuming she had the African Americans go back to Indiana to save her farm. Julia also wrote at a much later date that Dick's, quote, woods colt, Dick Coons, was getting married. I had to look up woods colt, but apparently it was a word to mean an extramarital child. So in a small community where everybody knew everything that was going on, we're lucky that Julia liked gossip, because we just get a little of it. And that tells us something about the people living. When James Dinsmore was managing the farm, it was the age of the farmer, the gentleman farmer. He could raise sheep, hogs, wheat, rye, fruit, grapes, and willows, and do quite well with that diversity. By the time Julia took over, farming was becoming more and more difficult. Small farms were disappearing. Farmers were finding it more profitable to specialize in one main crop or animal. And as Bellevue Bottoms turned to burley tobacco, Washington Duke was trying to monopolize the cigarette industry and ensure that tobacco farmers had only one price to sell at. Dick also raised a large melon patch and sold the produce in Burlington and across the river. Bellevue Bottoms was apparently known for the melons, and some years he and Julia split over $100. But more money was to be made in tobacco if the year was good. Loudon had his good years and his bad years. In 1885, Julia complained in her journal that they had turned down what they considered a bad price the previous winter, only to get an even worse price early in the year. She wrote in her journal, "They won't have enough to pay what they owe me. They have to let me have mine by law. But Dick's crop won't begin to pay for all he owes. Tenants often borrowed on the future crop. It wasn't as bad as the cotton lien in the deep South, but there were years that must have been very hard for the Loudon family. So in 1905, Boone County joined other counties in trying to form a pool of tobacco growers so they could present a united front against the American Tobacco Company. The goal of the Burley tobacco growers was to allow farmers to store their crops and get a portion of their money that was due them before the crop was actually sold, so they could hold the crop until the price went up. It didn't work out in 1905. They didn't have enough money to pay out to the farmers, so they told the farmers to find their own deal. The next several years went bust also, but in 1908, they were finally successful. And it seemed to work pretty well, although the farmers, Dick Loudon sometimes got a settlement 2 or 3 years afterwards. In 1911, Dick Loudon died. And he was buried in the across from the Bellevue Baptist graveyard near what is now Chuck's. A very nice marker, and I'm assuming his wife must have saved that money for a long time to put that up. But Julia writes quite a bit about Dick as he's dying and after he died. And so I am going to read quite a bit of this because it is so touching. And you can see the difference between the way she felt about Dick in 1880 and the way she felt about him in 1911. She wrote, August 19th, Dick Loudon was taken very sick after dinner with pain in the foot he cut a week ago and chill and high fever. He had Dr. Williamson and I fear blood poisoning. 6 days later, Dick worse. When I went to see him again just before dark, I gave him up. He was in delirium and industrious to the last, was talking about cutting corn. Poor Dick. On the next day, she writes, it is happy Dick today. He died last night about midnight, has entered into rest as the pious express it. The first he has had since he was big enough to work. Georgie says he used to say he would never leave Miss Julie till he was hauled away, and it has come true. Harry said he didn't want to work today, end quote. The next day, Julia went to the funeral down in Bellevue. They sang a fool hymn about will there be any stars in my crown, instead of reading, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Harry was kind and helped the family in their arrangements. He had worked with Dick on the place over 16 years without a crossword. Man comes and tills the ground and lies beneath. Dick was by nature industrious and kind and liberal and good to his family, end quote. So very nice memory. And Harry is who I'll talk about last. Harry Roseberry was born in 1881 in Boone County to George and Jane Seabury Roseberry. Jane grew up down the road from the Dinsmore farm. George somehow got to Boone County via Mason County, which is where he had been enslaved. Harry had several brothers and sisters who moved back and forth from Boone County over to Rising Sun, Indiana, depending on the time of the year, it sounds like. There were integrated schools in Indiana and not in Boone County. Harry did accompany his father to work for Julia Dinsmore as a day laborer, but in 1895, he decided to stay while his family moved across the river. Harry did go to school for a short time somewhere around the Dinsmore farm, but Julia wrote that, quote, some toughs burned the school down. So Julia taught him to read and write at home. He had about a 4th or 5th grade education. So we do have letters from him, but I would say that his education was just about as good as some of the tenants. He lived in what is now the kitchen cabin on the Dinsmore farm, although it only became the kitchen cabin, we've recently learned, after the freed people left it following the Civil War. By 1890, the Black population in Boone County had changed considerably. Remember when COA came in 1840s, it was almost 25%. By 1890, it was down to less than 5%. There were a few families nearby, but Harry and Nancy Magruder, a formerly enslaved woman, were the only Blacks permanently on the farm. Over the years, members of the Roseberry family sometimes moved in nearby, or lived on the property and worked for Julia Dinsmore, but it never lasted very long. He also, as witnessed by Julia's remarks on the death of Dick Loudon, seems to have gotten on well with the white men on the property. The work Harry did on the farm was quite different from their work, though. He did not raise tobacco until right before World War I. The price shot up from something like 7 to 9 cents a pound to 30 cents a pound. And one person got 40 cents a pound. That encouraged him to start raising tobacco, but he only did for a few years, and then the price came down again, and then it wasn't worth growing to him anymore. So it wasn't that he wasn't allowed to raise tobacco, but he tended to work closer to the main house. He had a large garden, he raised chickens and hogs, and he did work for Julia in the house, cleaning, and outside the house, in the yard. The tenants only entered one room of the house, and that was Julia's office. Harry also helped take care of the horses that Julia liked to ride, and he was in charge of taking her around in the carriage, which must have looked very fancy. When Julia's niece Patty purchased a car for the farm, it was Harry who learned to be a mechanic and drive the car. Then he got a chauffeur's license up in Burlington and was one of the very few people down in Bellevue Bottoms who was able to drive around a car in the very early 1900s. The year he moved to the farm, 1895, was the same year that Patty's husband, Tilden Selm, died. And she wanted to stay on the farm and start a ham business. So that is the smokehouse in the foreground there, and her instructions on boiling and baking a ham. Eventually, Patty's hams would go to hotels in Cincinnati, like the Burnett House, and also to the White House when Teddy Roosevelt, her friend, was president. Harry helped take care of the hogs, and he was also there for the slaughtering and curing of the meat. So Harry was paid by Julia 75 cents a day, $1 a day by the time she died. He was also paid randomly by Patty, and most of the letters we have from Harry are to Patty asking for his payment. In 1904, Susie Riley moved to the farm to do the cooking and cleaning for Julia, who was having trouble finding people who wanted to work in an old cabin kitchen and use an outhouse. Susie and Harry were married by the end of the year. In 1910, Julia allowed them to move into the middle part of this building, which was the only part there. And over the succeeding years, the house was built onto, and eventually there were 4 rooms. They raised 4 daughters and 2 granddaughters here. Julia complained that this house was too far away, and she had trouble yelling for Harry at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm sure Harry and Susie didn't mind that. Both of them were keen to see their children get a good education, and they sent them across the river to Rising Sun to go to school. They stayed with their Roseberry relatives until Susie bought a house or rented a house. I believe it started out renting a house over in Rising Sun, and she would stay there during the school year and come back in the summers. In the 1930s, schools for Black children in Boone County were improving, and Harry could send his granddaughters and his youngest daughter to Boone County schools. The county court paid Harry for transporting children to and from the schools. So you can see that they both really encouraged education and thought it was very important. They also enjoyed music. Susie had an organ in the house, they had a radio, and Harry played the fiddle. They would have big parties outside and invite Harry's relatives, who all loved music and played instruments. So very busy area. Julia Dinsmore got along very well with Harry. She had a little bit more trouble with Susie. She thought Susie talked too much. Like Koa showing up in some of the letters, Harry and Susie do show up more than the Loudons in Julia's letters to her nieces. Usually it's work, but sometimes it's relating a story that Susie told to Julia or that Harry told her. If she finds it amusing, and this one she found amusing. Quote, Susan did make me laugh once today. There was the usual sisterly warfare going down at her house, and she said Harry went up to the wine house and got a piece of hose and said he intended using it if the rippet wasn't stopped. And she laughed and said you could hear a pin drop. Julia began spending more and more time away from Boone County with her nieces in the late 19 teens and 1920s. Harry was then living closest to the main house, and he pretty much became in charge of keeping the main house closed and locked or cleaned and taking care of the yard in front and back. He was also paid more than anyone else on the property, and there weren't many people left. Dick Loudon's son, Flav, moved off the property a year after Julia died. His brother, Leomer, had already left. In 1928, Seaburn Brady moved across the road from the main house into a new tenant house that was built by Sally, Julia Dinsmore's niece, who had inherited the property from her. The Bradys stayed until the 1950s. Patty died in 1923 and left Harry and Susie $200 each. Susie wanted to take the money and purchase a house in Rising Sun, but I suspect someone in the Dinsmore family talked her out of it because Julia's health was starting to fail, and they'd liked having Harry around. Instead, Sally's husband, Frank, took the money and invested it in stocks. I don't know what happened to those after 1929. Julia died in 1926, and Sally then was paying Harry $65 a month. And you can see that Seaburn Brady across the way was making less. He was making $50. In the 1840s, Susie died in 1841, leaving Harry with 3 children in the house. And a few years later, Seaburn Brady wrote to Sally saying that he was thinking of leaving the farm because he didn't like taking orders, I assume is what he wrote, from a Black man, because this is what Sally wrote to Harry. Dear Harry, this is to tell you that if you want to stay on the place with me, you will have to get along with Seaburn in a friendly way and understand that being white, he is the head of the place in my absence, and what he says goes. Your friend, S.F. Cutchin. Sally increased Seaburn's pay to the same as Harry's, and soon he was making more than Harry. But when Sally died in 1947, she left Harry an annuity of $720. Considering she didn't leave anything to Seaburn Brady, who was a tenant, you can see that she considered Harry to be kind of a special category, just the way Julia did also. Sally's niece Isabella took over the farm, but she died not long after in 1953. And then it was down to her 3 children, with Bob Ferguson being the main business partner. He hired Margaret and Arthur Oots to stay in the main house while Harry remained in the Roseberry house. And as Harry got older and older, Margaret began taking care of him more. By 1965, Bob had purchased a trailer to put in front of the Roseberry house because the Roseberry house never had heat and never had water. So that way, Harry's life would be a little easier. Bob had floated the idea of moving Harry to Covington, but he was told by Harry, quote, never. When I leave here, I will have to be helpless or dead, as I would die very soon after. So a trailer was a solution. In 1968, Harry's daughter took him to Cincinnati, and he spent a little time in a nursing home and died in 1970. He's buried with his wife and 2 daughters in the Bellevue Baptist graveyard. Their graves are separated from the main part of the graveyard by a road, which may be because they were Black, but more recently, other people have been buried on that same side. So this is just kind of a sampling of 4 men who worked on farms who I think are kind of typical of the men who would have been working on farms in Boone County from 1840 to the 1920s and in southern Campbell and Kenton counties. And that's the end. I'm in an air-conditioned house, so I'm a little hot right now. But I guess that's it.
Yeah. Thank you for that presentation. Let's go over the trivia question real quick. We did have a correct answer to that. To repeat the question, it was the last full-time member of the Dinsmore family to stay in the house for short periods of time in the 70s and 80s was Martha Breasted. And she was the daughter-in-law of a famous man in his time. And the question was, Who was that man and what was he known for? The answer was James Henry Breasted, the first American Egyptologist. He was called to King Tut's tomb after it was opened and was the only one there who could read hieroglyphics. Patrick Rafferty was the winner, so congrats to him. We will get your prize to you. So let's go over some questions. We did have one. So they said that they live on what was Russell Loudon's farm located in the southern end of Bellevue Bottoms. Is there a relationship to Dick?
You know, the Loudons had so many children and a lot of them were men. I am in contact with one of Flav Loudon's descendants, but there was a Jesse Loudon, a John Loudon, a James Loudon. So I bet they are related. I couldn't tell you what the relationship is, but they definitely are related.
Some good feedback. Thanks for the presentation.
It's pretty cool. I don't think we have any more questions in so far. If anybody has a question really quick they want to get in, we did have some great feedback. So thank you. It was a fascinating presentation. Guess nobody has any questions. Oh, another question. The layers of relationships were complex. Asking about the complexity of the relationships between the people.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a neat thing where you have a farm and everybody kind of has to get along with each other. So where at the same time period, you have violence against Blacks on an individual farm, it seems like they seem to work together. So the Germans and the enslaved people work together well. Harry and Dick Loudon worked together well. Now, Harry and Seaburn Brady did not work together well. But yes, I think that's what makes it interesting and real. Thank you for the question.
So let's go ahead and wrap up. So at the museum, we would like to promote our curator chats that we have available on Facebook and YouTube every Thursday. We also have our Music at BCM concert series. We do have a concert tomorrow, June 16th, with Ben Levin and the Heaters. All grown up and still singing and playing the blues. Ben Levin brings the Heaters back to share at least 50 shades of blues. So if you're interested in that, please come see the show tomorrow night. He's been here for numerous years in the past, and he always puts on a great show. It is the place to be on Thursday nights this summer, and our full schedule of concerts can be found on our website, which again is bcmuseum.org. So that's all we have for this evening. Thank you again to all of our sponsors and supporters of BCM. We'd also like to thank the staff, trustees, and members of the Behringer-Crawford Museum. For more Northern Kentucky history through the week, you can check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, where again, you can find our curators chats and the previous history hours. Please like and subscribe to those videos. There will not be a Northern Kentucky History Hour next week as we continue the bi-weekly schedule, but we will be back on June 29th with Burkus Brewery with Paul Miller. So until then, take care, everyone, and thanks for joining us. And thank you so much, Cathy.
Oh, and thank you for all the good comments. Thank you. It's nice to have people listen.